first. Everybody smile. Camera, good evening. Look at all of us here. Beautiful people. Hi, Janet. Okay, now everybody join me in turning them off. How is everybody this evening? Great. Everybody's holidays going lovely? Yes. Somewhat? Okay, I'm going to be talking at you, you're going to have to talk back to me. So this is the warm-up here. Well, I am so thrilled, honored, flattered to have you all here. I'm sure I can say the same for Janet. It's just a total joy. And I see people here that I've known for years. I see people here that I've known and haven't seen in years. And I see people here that I don't know. So that's the best mix. So if you looked at your programs, you saw that the first item is a little discussion demonstration on Dichterliebe. So the first work that we're going to do, the first half of the concert, is Robert Schumann's Dichterliebe, which is just a rock-solid classic of the song cycle genre. If you know about art song, you know. And if you don't know about art song, I'm telling you now, Robert Schumann's Dichterliebe is as good as it gets. It's the classic of the genre. And it is, I find, in about 30-35 minutes of music, it contains so many distances and perspectives and colors of the human experience, and they go by really quick. And so I thought it might help make it a little more special to talk about it a little bit, give a little history about who is Schumann, who is Heine, the poet, what is the nature of their poetics, give some things to listen for in the rendition, and then we will, and then I'll draw a little fun little parallel at the end, and then we'll perform the work itself, okay? So, I'm going to say 3 names, and I wonder if anybody in the room will recognize these names. If I said the names Florestan, Eusebius, and Dr. Raro, do those names ring a bell to anyone? Does anybody know who I'm talking about? Well, actually, as a matter of fact, Florestan, Eusebius, and Dr. Raro is all the same person. They're all Robert Schumann. This is maybe the first inkling of kind of what an unusual guy he was. He had different names for different of his compositional personalities, and also different of his personalities when he was a critic. So Florestan, well, I'll talk a little bit later about who those guys were. So briefly, a little biography of Robert Schumann. Well, only enough to illuminate Dichterliebe, so we won't deal with the very sad last years of his life, but let's talk about his life up to the time of the composition of Dichterliebe. He was born in 1810. He grew up in Zwickau, it's a very small town in Germany, and he grew up in the atmosphere of his father, who was a book publisher. And so from a very young age, he was steeped in good literature. Really, he was very serious and formed a taste for highbrow good literature. And if you know, being born in 1810, there was a lot of good literature starting to come out at that time, in German. That's the period of the flowering, really, of the early flowering of German literature. He particularly fell in love with Jean-Paul, who was one of the early German romantics, and Schumann was inducted by Jean-Paul into the aesthetic of Romanticism. Meanwhile, as he's forming his literary self, and keep in mind, Robert Schumann actually wrote novels. A lot of people don't know that, but he published, I don't know if they were ever published, but he wrote 2 full-length novels in his life. Meanwhile, he's showing tremendous promise as a young musician. In fact, he was such a good young musician that he formed the opinion at a very young age that nobody in Zwickau could teach him anything, and he was too good for all his instructors. And we will find that a certain boldness bordering on well-deserved arrogance is going to be part of Schumann's mature personality as well. One encyclopedia of composers says, "It has been related that Schumann, as a child, possessed rare taste and talent for portraying feelings and characteristic traits in melody. Aye, he could sketch the different dispositions of his intimate friends by certain figures and passages on the piano so exactly and comically that everyone burst into loud laughter at the similitude of the portrait. Eventually, when he's 16, Schumann moves to Leipzig and starts studying with the very famous pianist and teacher Friedrich Wieck, whose daughter, Clara Wieck, he is 9 years old at the time, but who a few years down the line Schumann's going to fall in love with. And he's going to have a very long, unsuccessful courtship. Wieck is standing in the way of Robert and Clara. That's, for those that like 19th century love stories, that's one of the great ones. His courtship of, he just, even when they lived in different cities, he was still in love with Clara. He was not discouraged by the intervention of the potential father-in-law, and eventually he got Wieck to agree to the marriage. In 1828, when he was 18 years old, Schumann decided to go away from music, partially because he was a little discouraged studying with Wieck, who was something of a tyrant, and study law. 2 years later, 1830, Schumann is 20 years old, and he hears a concert that reminds him of the power of music and causes him to redevote himself to the compositional craft. You might be surprised to learn, I was very surprised to learn, whose music was on the concert that opened Schumann's ears and made him want to be a composer again. Was it Beethoven? Was it Mozart? No, actually it was Rossini, surprisingly enough, which a lot of people would consider Rossini as not the deepest, most mind-blowing music, but that was it for Schumann. And Schumann's music has no resemblance to that of Rossini, which makes it all the more surprising. So 2 years later, he produces his first major work, Papillon, for piano, which is based on a series of impressions from a novel by Jean-Paul. So already Schumann's deep relationship to the Romantic literary school is a major part of his compositional personality. And for the remainder of that decade, for the whole 1830s, Schumann writes nothing but piano music. In fact, he's heard to say, or he tells people on a couple occasions, that he considers vocal music to be less, that's not the real music, that's kind of a degraded genre. And true enough, through the whole 1830s, he writes nothing but solo piano music. And of course, the great corpus of solo piano music. Schumann is one of the great solo piano composers. And it's during this period, this decade of the 1830s, is when he's having his long, unsuccessful courtship of Clara, which he finally, in 1839, Wieck drops his legal objection to Robert marrying Clara. And it may be then related, the fact that in 1840, Schumann suddenly breaks into the genre of song. He wrote, in the year 1840, 138 songs. Wow. So to music historians, which is going to be half of his lifetime output. So he'll continue writing songs for the rest of his life, but only half of his art songs were written in the year 1840. So to music historians, that's known as the Liederjahr, or the year of song. He also, in the same period in the 1830s, is starting up the publication of his journal. He was a major music critic, in addition to being one of the great composers of the 19th century. He was a profound commentator on the music of the time. Many of the great contemporaries of his from the 19th century owe Schumann their legacy, because he was the one who promoted them in his, what was called the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, or the new journal for music. And it's in the Neue Zeitschrift that he introduces this group of critics. He called them the Davidsbündler, which means David's group, or David's tribe. He called them, the David in question is the David of the Bible, who slew Goliath of the Philistines. Schumann considered himself the opponent of the Philistines of his day, the culturally ignorant of his day who were making all this schlocky art that he thought was degraded, and he set himself up as he was gonna fight them. Which again makes it surprising that Rossini was his musical guardian angel, because many people would consider him to be the schlock of the day. But and so the Davidsbündler were this group that were fighting the Philistines, and they were all Schumann. So Florestan was one of them. Florestan represented Schumann's more passionate, kind of erratic, voluble side. And Eusebius was one of them, which was his dreamy, introspective side. And so the fact that those are his two sides points us towards what a romantic he was, right? There's only two ways to be. Either you're laying there in the field being all dreamy and soulful and introspective, or you're in the midst of this high passion. There's no other options, right? And then in between the two, he had this figure, Dr. Raro. Dr. Raro was the learned member of the Davidsbündler who would mediate between the other two. So here we are. It's 1840. It's the Liederjahr, and this is the year in which Dichterliebe was written. The poems of Dichterliebe are which means a poet's love. That title is Schumann's title, not the poet's title. The poems of Dichterliebe are written by a man named Heinrich Heine. Heine is born in 1797, so he's 13 years Schumann's senior. And he, in his youth, and in fact throughout his life, made a reputation for himself as an extreme political liberal, libertarian, pro-democracy, pro-enlightenment, pro-revolution, and as many liberal minds were in Europe at that time, he was pro-Napoleon. So he was initially charmed by the Romantic movement, the ideals of Romanticism. And at this point, this is where I would want to throw the floor open and ask, what do we think is meant by the term Romanticism? When I say romantic, when it comes to art and art history, what does that term mean to you? Does anybody want to throw any ideas out? Dana, could I get a glass of water? While these folks think.
Passion for sure.
I think Romeo and Juliet, whatever.
In painting, it's realism and it's nature scenes. It's big, expansive, natural vistas with maybe small figures admiring it.
But it could also be sacrifice and war.
Mm-hmm.
Hyperbole.
What's that?
Hyperbole.
Hyperbole?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Those are all good. That's all true as far as subject matter. I'm going to quote the musicologist Julia Perry. She sums it up very well. She says, Romanticism is that which concerns itself with raising, thank you so much, Dana, with raising all parts of life, especially its contradictions, onto the higher aesthetic plane. So, to put it another way, it's idealism. It's a highly idealistic form, and it believes that all the experiences of human life can be raised to a high plane if seen through the soulful, apprehending eye of a true artist. And the highest artist in Romantic thought is the poet. So even Beethoven was paying himself a compliment when he called himself a Tondichter, a poet in tone. But Heine, who was originally drawn to Romanticism, eventually became disaffected and saw Romanticism as a bit of a lie. And in his mature period, Heine is known for his bitterness, his irony, and his kind of sardonic way, although he still maintained a very heartfelt and soulful approach as well. So I'll just read one poem of Heine here, which is, shows something of his relationship to Romanticism. The symbol of the early German Romantics was a blue flower. That comes from a essay by Novalis. And Heine writes, "At the crossroad will be buried he who killed himself. There grows a blue flower, suicide's flower. I stood at the crossroad and sighed. The night was cold and mute. By the light of the moon moved slowly suicide's flower." So Heine is saying Romanticism is dead. So it's a very interesting, now we're going to find a very interesting intersection between these two people. Robert Schumann, who is the quintessential Romantic, always remained that his whole life, and Heine, this disaffected, if you will, a post-Romantic. So there's two reasons that Heine kind of grows embittered. First is his ideals die in Europe. He thinks that after the French Revolution there's going to be a huge spread of democracy. Napoleon's going to save freedom in Europe. Doesn't happen. In fact, after the Napoleonic era, he sees his native Germany, the German states, becoming extremely repressive and very reactionary. So he kind of turns his back on his German heritage. In fact, he spends the rest of his life as an exile in Paris. And he was also, Heine was Jewish. And he was, therefore, extremely excluded from German society, which at first he loved so well and wanted to be a part of. And so his disaffection as a German Jew in the early 19th century is also part of what will become his artistic disaffection. Okay, so one element of Heine's poetry that's going to be very important in talking about Dichterliebe is called the Stimmungsbruch, or the mood break. So many of Heine's poems will set up this beautiful idealistic romantic tone in the first 3 quarters, and then at the end he will break it and he will disillusion you. And that's a classic move of his, to engage your heart and then to kind of shatter it. Exactly right. He wrote the Buch der Lieder, which means the Book of Songs, in 1827. So natural that these poems are going to end up being set to music because he calls them songs from the very beginning. And the Buch der Lieder contains the lyrisches Intermezzo, the lyric intermezzo, from which Schumann will draw the poems of Dichterliebe. Jeffrey Sammons, the art historian, has said that no other poet, with the exception of the psalmist in the Bible, has been set to music as often as Heine. And Schubert set Heine, and here we have Schumann setting Heine, as well as a long list of other composers. Schumann initially selected 20 poems from the lyric intermezzo, but between the composing phase and the publishing phase, he dropped 4 of them. So the Dichterliebe that we know today is a 16-song cycle. These 16 songs share a theme of longing or lost or unrequited love. And it's possible to impose on these 16 songs a narrative of a particular lover, but you have to kind of stretch and be tenuous to do so. So many people have tried to put a story onto Dichterliebe over the years, but I think it's more satisfying to regard Dichterliebe as a fragmentary work. It's a work of a series of impressions and miniatures. We can imagine that it's one lover longing for one beloved, but if so, it's not an arc with a beginning, middle, and end. Does that make sense? Are you with me so far? So I'm again going to quote musicologist Julia Perry here. She writes, "Is perhaps above all about how a story that is essentially not a story reflects upon itself through the means of emotion rather than events." She says, "The scenes of Dichterliebe unfold before us as the changing vistas of an inner self, where the poet-singer is a dreamer, traveling in mind and body through a fleeting succession of associated ideas." So, the main elements of Dichterliebe's poetics: fragmentation, unresolved longing, the Stimmungsbruch, or the break of mood at the end of a song, and the big one, the one that really we find interesting and that causes us to question, is the interaction between Heine's bitterness and Schumann's sincerity. And there's been a lot of discussion over the years. Did Schumann understand Heine? Did he have blinders over his eyes that he didn't understand how bitter this man was, and why did he write such heartfelt, sincere music to go with this poetry? I think the skeleton key to understanding their relationship, their aesthetic relationship, can be found in a letter that Schumann wrote. In 1835, this is 5 years before he's going to compose Dichterliebe, Schumann writes, he names a list of artists: Byron, Heine, Victor Hugo, and others. "Poetry has, on occasions in eternity, put on the mask of irony so as not to show its face of pain. Perhaps the kind hand of a genius will take off that mask someday." I suggest that this is how we regard Dichterliebe. Schumann's kind hand is removing the mask of irony so that we can see the heart, the real pain that is inside of the person of Heine. So I want to point out, before we actually sing the whole thing through, some things to notice in Dichterliebe. So Janet and I are going to demonstrate a couple things here. There's 5 traits I want you to listen for, or I don't care what I want, but there's 5 traits I invite you to 5 traits that I think will increase your enjoyment of Dichterliebe. So the first thing to notice about Dichterliebe is its harmonic adventurousness. So his color palette of harmonies is extremely diverse and very inventive for the time. And it starts from the very first note. So I'm going to ask Janet to just play the first bar of the very first song, which sounds like this. Yeah. So Janet, would you play those first 6 notes as just one block chord? This is the harmony being outlined in the first, right? That's the starting harmony of our piece. So he's not going to let you off that train for the whole rest of the piece. You're constantly being pulled sideways. Another moment I'd like to point out, this is in the song entitled Und wussten's die Blumen die Kleinen. And I encourage you now, as we get to this part, to have your translation nearby, because to know what we're talking about will help you, I think, appreciate these moments. But we're just going to play for you here the first large phrase of this song, which is the one, if the flowers the little ones knew. And listen how in the second line, the second of the 4 short lines, the harmony feels like it moves sideways. He shifts into almost like an alternate dimension after you think you know where you're going from the first line, and then he moves it like this. Und wüssten's die Blumen, die Kleinen, wie tief verwundet mein Herz. Sie würden mit mir weinen, zu heilen meinen Schmerz. So did you hear that second line kind of goes like that? The second thing that I think will help you to engage with throughout the whole piece is the question of, does Schumann engage with Heine's irony? I'm going to get my music here for this one. Sometimes Schumann does, so sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. So one of the classic examples where people have said Schumann does not understand Heine is in song number 4, Wenn ich in deine Augen sehe, when I look into your eyes. So if you read along the words there, you see that the last line has a very distinct Stimmungsbuch. He says, this thing makes me happy, this thing makes me happy, but when you say, I love you, I must weep bitterly. But if you listen to Schumann's setting, he keeps the same sweet, melancholic tone throughout, like this. Wenn ich in deine Augen sehe, so schwindet all mein Leid und Weh. Doch wenn ich küsse deinen Mund, so werd ich ganz und gar gesund. Wenn ich mich lehn an deine Brust, kommt über mich wie Himmelslust. Doch wenn du sprichst, ich liebe dich, so muss ich weinen, bitterlich. So did we hear the Stimmungsbuch? If so, it's very subtle. On the other hand, at times, Schumann directly engages with Heine's bitter or ironic tone. Let's turn our attention to the 11th song. This is a kind of a cutesy little love story, which is obvious both Heine and Schumann are making fun of this stupid little story. We'll just hear the beginning part. Ein Jüngling liebt ein Mädchen, die hat eine andere Welt. Der andere liebt eine andere und hat sich mit dieser vermählt. Right, so the sing-songiness of it is kind of, we're making fun of this tale. It's not hard fun. So, to what extent does Schumann engage with Heine's irony is an ongoing question. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is the wealth of extremely unusual textures. This is where Schumann really takes off from what has existed before him and really does some original things. So in the 9th song, there is a fluting and fiddling. We have this unusual situation where the main melody is actually in the piano, and what I'm singing is just almost like a descant or an accompaniment to her real melody. So let's just listen to the beginning of that one. Das ist ein Flöten und Geigen, Trompeten schmettern da rein, Trompeten schmettern da rein. Right, so and if you read the lyrics there, it's about he's hearing the wedding band where his beloved is getting married to someone else. So the piano is playing the melody of the wedding band, and I'm just singing a separate counter melody on top of it. Schubert doesn't do that. Composers before Schumann don't do that, textures like that. To demonstrate another really unusual texture, listen to the beginning of number 13, which is I have cried in my dream. Ich hab im Traum geweint. Mir träumte, du lägest im Grab. Ich wachte auf und die Träne floss noch von der Wange herab. Right, so in this song, the voice and piano are never together. And in fact, it starts with a long phrase of unaccompanied voice. Again, that's a pretty bold move, given the artistic conventions of the day, for Schumann to write a texture like that. And from beginning to end, Dichterliebe is like this surprising, unusual relationship between voice and piano, the textures. The fourth aspect is, of course, the tremendously beautiful emotional tone painting and the intensity of Schumann's emotional portrayal. And just a couple examples of that. First of all, the last song, number 16, the old angry songs. Listen to how he shows the old angry songs. Die alten bösen Liebe, die Träume bös und Talg, die lasst uns jetzt begraben vor einem großen Sarg. Hinein leg ich gern manches, und doch sag ich noch nicht was. Der Sarg muss sein noch größer, dies Heidelberger Fass. Right? And the other one that I want to call attention to as far as the emotional tone painting is, let's take a look at number 5. Number 5 is, I wish I could plunge my soul into the chalice of the lily. It's erotic, right? The nature of this song is extremely sexual. And he's talking about the trembling and the quivering and all of this. Listen to how he portrays this in the musical texture. Ich will meine Seele tauchen in den Kelch der Lilie hinein. And so on. this quivering element in piano shows the
And so on.
and so on. And the final element that makes Dichterliebe so interesting aesthetically is the extensive soloism of the piano part. So again, quoting musicologist, whose name I remember, Perry, in Dichterliebe certainly the piano does not merely form a supportive accompaniment to the voice, but rather keeps disrupting and contradicting it. It remains silent or speaks to itself once the singing voice has ceased. The piano is thus one side of the Janus face structure of Schumann's song. And the voice teacher Richard Miller wrote, in almost all of the lead repertory, the pianist is not an accompanist but a collaborator. From Schubert through Strauss, the level of skill demanded from the keyboard artist for the performance of Lieder is equal to that required of a solo pianist. The notion that the song literature is unrewarding for the pianist who simply accompanies the singer is a naive one. On the contrary, the level of technical and musical skill demanded from a pianistic full partner is not less in the Lied than in the sonata and concerto literatures. And I have the best that there is in town right here. I just want to show one example of one of these unusual, at the end of number 12, Am leuchtenden Sommermorgen, as at the end of many of the songs, but I'm just picking this one, there's a lengthy piano postlude after I finish singing, which sounds like this. And I'll just point out for your consideration that this same music from the end of number 12 comes back at the end of the last song. So we just heard the beginning of the last song, right? That angry, Die alten bösen Lieder. And it's going to end with a lengthy reprise of this music. So I'll leave it to your own imagination to connect what does Schumann mean by bringing back this postlude right after I've sung the line, "Don't be angry," the little flowers say to me, "Don't be angry with our sister, you sad, pale man," to the end of the cycle when I've just sung the words, "In that coffin I sank all my love and all my hopes along with it." So what's the connection between those two moments? And at the risk of talking too long, which I realize I've already passed that point, but you can't stop once begun. I just want to take a moment to draw a little, what I found to be a fascinating parallelism between the poetics of Dichterliebe and this other totally unrelated poetic form. So this is not a rigorous connection or parallel I'm drawing. I just think it's a fun resonance. At the same time that I was studying Dichterliebe, I came across a poetic form which started in Arabic poetry, passed on to Persian, Turkish poetry, and is now a worldwide form, but particularly practiced in South Asia, in Urdu, in Hindi, in Bengali. And that's the form of the Ghazal. And the Ghazal is a traditional poem in which a series of couplets are unrelated to each other in terms of a narrative story, but are related to each other in terms of theme and imagery. The Ghazal always has a subject matter of longing and yearning, and it always has, every couplet ends with the same word, even though the rest of the line is not related. So, it's a beautiful form. So like Heine, we have this fragmentary aesthetic where the parts don't go together into a literal whole. We have a shared theme, which is the theme of longing or lost love or unrequited love, or in the case of Ghazal, a lover who's far away. And the unexpected twist of Heine's Stimmungsbruch becomes in the Ghazal this delightful recursion of the last words of every line. And so I'll just read one Ghazal. This is a Ghazal originally in English, and this is by G.S. Sharat Chandra. It's called The Anonymous Lover. Like a phantom, I've pursued your guise from the beginning, cupped in your hands my own heart like dice from the beginning. Was I wrong to have so fallen for your indifferent heart, Providence misguiding me with lies from the beginning? So notice that there's actually an internal rhyme that carries through as well. I kneel to pray, but see that faraway look on your face. Some say love like death pulls a knife from the beginning. Wafted into clouds, let my words die if they fly nowhere, when in your heart are gratified my eyes from the beginning. The past, present, and future wear their indifferent gaze. Friends leave, turn enemies, say the wise from the beginning. This loneliness that has grown like a vine in a crevice, having nothing to reach, gently sighs from the beginning. I wake from a dream, seeing your face skating on water. I touch, knowing your untouched state flies from the beginning. In a pool of mirrors, we're minnows pretending to be whales. I'm nameless as a shadow of your cries from the beginning. So that's Ghazal. And as I say, it's not a strict parallel, but I just found that a delightful little resonance between two totally unrelated poetic traditions. With that, ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy Robert Schumann's Dichterliebe. This is a complete single work, these 16 songs, so please do not applaud between